In this video, we're going to be working on our first figure painting. This one's kind of fun. It's pretty simple. It kind of has a 1950s or 40s look, almost like a Norman Rockwell style painting. And while this painting is still considered a figure painting, the majority of this tutorial is going to be based on painting fabric like the dress, which takes up about 3/4 of the painting. If you'd like to paint along with me, I recommend pausing the video here, taking a screenshot, and using that to set up a grid to use as your reference. So once I have my contours drawn in with graphite, I'm going to use some of this vinyl masking tape to mark off the areas where I don't want paint. So once we have this mask in, we could start adding in our flesh tone. It's so important to add a little bit, let it dry, and then come back and add a little bit more. If you add too much of this paint, it's going to seep underneath the tape and it's going to get extremely messy. So do the best you can to exercise some patience and go nice and slow with it. When I add this flesh tone, you'll see that I add a little bit more paint to the edges. That's going to make it darker, and what that's going to do is going to give it a rounded look. Those areas that are a little bit darker are going to look farther away from us, and the areas that are lighter are going to look closer to us, so it's going to give us a rounded appearance of the arm or the forearm. This flesh tone is a transparent color, although Createx Burnt Sienna doesn't seem 100% transparent to me. I think there's a little bit of white in there. But anyway, when you're using a transparent color like this mixture, we achieve our darks by spraying more paint, and our lights are used by spraying less paint, and then in that area using an eraser to pull out some of the highlights. So when we get to this point, we could see something very interesting. When you use an airbrush with masks like this, you get a very sharp line on the outside and a very smooth surface. I think this is what people say when they say something has an airbrushed look. It almost looks too smooth. It almost has a plastic-like look to it. If you want to change that, there's a bunch of things we can do. I'm going to leave it like that, add a little bit of texture with my eraser, but I want to keep this one smooth and simple because this is more of a beginner tutorial. As we move on to the hand, I want to try to do the same thing I did with the arm by keeping it simple. I'm not going to go for a crazy amount of detail on this, just enough to make it look like a hand. With this thumb, I want to make sure it has that rounded look to it, just like what we did with the arm. So I'm going to spray some more paint along the edges first, which is going to darken it, and then I'll spray a little bit lighter as I get toward the middle of the thumb. And that's going to give that transition from dark to light, giving each finger a rounded look to it. So anytime you're airbrushing, you have to mask areas, because if you don't, the airbrush is going to spray paint in areas you don't want, which is called overspray. And it works great for a lot of things, but when you're trying to keep everything sharp and detailed, it's going to hurt you. So a mask is the best way to prevent that from happening. One of my favorite ways to mask off areas is to use vinyl tape made by 3M. That's the thin blue tape that you see right underneath the thumb. It works great for the majority of things, but one of the problems is it's difficult to wrap around smaller areas like the edge of the thumb here. So what I did was I switched off to an airbrush shield to get those curved shapes around the fingernail and around the top part of the thumb. The other option to mask off areas is to use Frisket film, which I use later on in the video, and we'll talk about it then when we get to it. I'm going to use this same flesh tone just to define some of the edges around the nail and the cuticle, and then come in with an eraser and pull out some highlights along the middle section of the thumb. If you're going to use this technique to erase paint, make sure you're using an aggressive eraser. The kind I'm using here is called an ink eraser or a sand eraser. A normal pencil eraser like the pink ones aren't aggressive enough, and they're not going to be able to remove this. The other thing you're going to need is a smooth surface. So down in the video description I have a link showing you how to make a canvas that's very smooth to use for airbrush painting, especially to be used with erasing techniques. To paint the rest of the fingers, I'm just going to use my shield to establish some of the dark lines between the fingers. As you can see, I just place it at the edge and then spray a tiny bit of paint underneath. That's going to help define each finger. From there, I could spray a little bit more paint across the top and then use that to work with. If I want to erase something out, I'm able to, and if I want to make it darker, I could just spray a little bit more paint on top of it. The less paint you spray down, the easier it is to erase. So it's best to always build these up in slow layers. If you spray a lot of paint and try to erase it, it gets messy, it smears around, and some areas will lift up and get some very bright highlights. So try to keep it slow and build your values up slowly. It's going to make the process easier, and you'll also add more textures to it by building up in layers. So that's pretty much it for the hand. We're going to keep it simple like I said before. Now we're going to move on to the hat. So the first thing I do is mask off the whole thing, and using sepia from Createx Illustration Colors, I just spray a light tone over the whole area. Then for the hand, I mask it off using Frisket film and cut away around the fingers. This way I could spray all around the hand and not worry about paint getting on that original flesh tone. As you can see, when I peel it off here, the color is exactly the same it was before I added down the color for the hat. So after this is all peeled off, I could see that the hat looks a little too smooth, has too much of that airbrush look. So I'm going to break it up using an eraser just to pull out some highlights and kind of create some texture to the hat, make it look like it has a thatched hat look to it. So moving down to the dress here, I'm doing the same thing as before, as masking off the areas where I don't want paint, and then I'm going to spray with a red color that I mixed. I find colors right out of the bottle too vibrant for me, so I usually want to knock down that saturation by adding a drop or two of the complementary color. So here I used around 10 drops of scarlet red and then 1 drop of moss green, just to dilute that red a little bit. To add some of the creases or folds in the dress, what I like to do is take either a sheet of ripped paper or my airbrush shield and spray a small amount in an area, and that's going to give me a defined edge, which is either the start or the end of a fold. From there I can come with my eraser and define the highlight. This way we have a highlight and a shadow, making it look like a crease. I want to darken some of the areas in the creases here, so I'm using a small amount of pure black that's thinned out with distilled water, just in these creases to darken them up more than what I had before. As we move into the main part of the dress here, I want to spray a thin amount of this red paint across the whole section. This way it gives me a base layer and I have something to work with. If I want to make something lighter, I can erase into it, and if I want to make it darker, I could obviously spray more paint. When you're filling in a large section with an airbrush, it's important to remember that a lot of the pigment is going to be atomized into the air, and you're going to have a lot of dust floating around. So it's important to wear some sort of mask to protect your lungs, maybe an N95 or a respirator, because if you're doing this day after day over years, it can't be good for you, even though the paint's non-toxic. Just remember that. Try to use something just to protect the air that you're breathing in, to protect your lungs. Just like up in the sleeve where I want an area to have a fold or a crease, I'm using my shield and spraying a tiny thin amount of black paint. This way it's going to darken these areas and it's going to give me defined sections where a crease starts or where one ends. Now I'm adding the polka dots in with this small shield that has different size holes in it using opaque white paint. The nice thing about putting the polka dots across the whole dress is it hides some of the flaws, so you don't have to worry too much about trying to get all the creases and the folds in the fabric looking perfect, because this is going to hide it and it's going to make the process easier. In the next section of this dress, I added the polka dots before adding the folds. It's really up to you which way you want to go. You can add them before or after. It really doesn't make much of a difference. So I'm going to use my shield here to darken up some of the areas on this dress here and to create some of the creases like we did before. When you press down the shield and spray a lot of paint, it's going to make the fold look very sharp. And if you don't use a shield and just spray in an area like this right here, it's going to make it look like more of a subtle curve or a more subtle fold in the dress. So keep that in mind. It's good to alternate between the two. Keep some sharper and darker and keep some other parts softer so you have that flowing look of fabric that's in a dress. The last thing I want to do with this fabric is lighten some of the highlighted areas. So I'm going to use some white opaque paint and I'm going to lightly spray it in the bright areas. Now just remember, when you use a white opaque paint over any other color that you have down, it's going to shift the hue of that color toward a blue grayish color. So the red's still going to look fine, but you're going to see it's going to have a slight grayish tinge to it. That's okay on fabric or anything that you're painting, as long as it's not flesh. If it's any sort of skin color, it looks very strange. It has a grayish color to it. So just keep that in mind if you want to use opaque colors over your original value. Moving on to the hair, I'm using burnt umber that's thinned with a few drops of distilled water. Now, burnt umber is very transparent, so you're going to need a lot of coats to build up a dark value, which is good in this case. So as I'm laying this down, I'm not thinking about detail. I'm just trying to think of large blocks of value, some dark sections where the shadows are and some light sections where the highlights are. Eventually, we're going to put hair in the highlight section so it looks more realistic. But for now, it's easy just to block in larger areas, basically transitions from dark to light. That's going to help make the hair look a little bit more natural, and of course building these values up slowly. You could see also that I masked off the lower part of the hat so that this burnt umber stays away from that and just stays on the hair section. Now I'm going to switch over to sepia that's also thinned with some distilled water and darken these areas more, just so we have a little bit more contrast between the highlight and the shadow. To get hair looking relatively realistic, it's important to not paint every single hair that you see. You want to try to paint clumps of hair. So where a bunch of hairs together, it's going to shift from a shadow to a highlight and then back to a shadow. So you're painting large sections of hair rather than each individual hair. If you try to paint each one, it kind of looks like straw and it looks very fake. Of course, there's going to be some flyaway hairs and stuff, but it's trying to keep this as simple as possible is going to help make it look a little bit more realistic. So you can see I'm just kind of blocking in the large areas, starting to get the shape of hair. Of course, we're going to need some more work, but we're going to build it up slowly and then go from there. After I have these dark shadows mapped in, I'm going to switch over to a razor blade, which is basically an X-Acto blade, and I'm going to use that to pull out highlights. When you use the blade, what happens is you're cutting out the paint back to the substrate, which is basically gessoed canvas. So it's going to be very white and very, very bright, these highlights. So we're not going to leave them like that. We're going to spray over them with the original color, which was burnt umber. So once these are down, I put a thin coat of burnt umber over it, and that helps kind of push them back. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to keep building up layer by layer of these, eventually getting a more and more realistic hair look. Remember, this is a beginner tutorial, so I'm not going into a ton of detail on the hair. You can work pretty quickly like this and get a look that looks pretty realistic, and it does a good job at representing hair. If you want to go into more detail, you just spend more time on it and study your reference to try to mimic it and get as close as possible to what you're seeing. That way you'll have a more realistic look. But you can see here, this works just fine. So we'll leave it like that and move on to the next part. So as we move along to the left arm here, this is going to be the last part of this first part of this figure painting tutorial. Using the same flesh tone from the beginning of the video, I'm starting up on this elbow section and using the shield just to darken some of these areas so it looks like I have a crease where the elbow is. And then I'm going to very lightly spray this color across this whole section, knowing that the masking tape around the side is going to keep that shape of the arm that I had drawn out. As you can see in the lower part of the arm where the hand is, it looks a little strange now, kind of odd. It's because she's holding a suitcase in this hand, so some of the hand is covered by it. So it looks weird now, but we'll change that when we get to that part of it and paint the bag. So that's going to complete the first part of this. I'll have the next video up in a week or so. Thank you so much for everyone who watched. It means a lot to me if you liked it or sat through this whole thing. So I appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. We're going to be working on a more realistic, difficult portrait, so a more advanced one in the next full video. So hope you come back for that one. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.